Karen said I do theory, and that is correct. I see myself primarily as a theorist rather than a researcher like Dr. Sager. Not that none of the other faculty, all the other faculty use theory, but I've always been into building it more than anything else. And a couple of weeks ago I signed a contract with Oxford for a book which will present the theory I've been working with most intensely for the last 15 years, and really is part of a chain of stuff that I'm going to describe to you that goes back at least 30 years.
Oxford. For those of you who don't know, Oxford is kind of the...
well, not, to me, not quite as far off as Cambridge, but
oh, okay.
Pretty good. And when I talked with Dr. Taylor last week about, the kinds of things that you've emphasized in the course, she noted that you've been focusing on the theory as it shows up in the context of the history of the discipline, in the context of other disciplines, psych, soc, things like that, and also in terms of the person's personal position within the discipline. So what I'm going to do is engage in some researcher reflexivity and see if I can sort of weave for you a narrative of how I came to this particular theory, and along the way how it fits in with some of the things you've learned about the discipline, the ways in which both Dietz and Griffin sort of give you dimensions for sorting out theories and so on, put it in that framework, and hopefully give you a sense of what this theory is about, and perhaps even some of its epistemology, which I know is another background concern. So I'm not going to get into details of the theory. I do want to hopefully give you some time at the end of the hour to fill in some of the pieces, give you another sense of it than what's in this chapter I had you read. But if you happen to be interested, I'm more than happy to share details. And I'm going to take this opportunity to do some advertising. If you are interested at all, I'm coming back to teach Com 320 in the spring, which is the communication and language course, which is my favorite. And
for my grad students, I'm sure we could figure a 600 version of it if we need to.
Oh, I was going to say, do we get...
If you were to take this course, you would become an expert in the model of communication that's involved here. You have a pretty solid sense of its constituting theory, which is the theory I'm working with, and what's a method known as conversation analysis for looking at human interaction. So those are three things that the course really focuses on. So I'm just going to sort of get going here. Please stop me with questions. Okay, I don't mind at all. Okay, that's real helpful. Things I need to fill in, skip over things I assume you know, and so on. So, little personal history. Started out as an engineer, so I got a pretty strong science and engineering background. I bailed out of that into English literature, and from there got into technical writing and eventually into communication, into this discipline.
Technical writing as in grant writing, or technical writing as in...
No, technical writing is in science and engineering writing. What else do you do if you move out of engineering into English literature? Yeah. That seems to be the obvious thing. So never done a lot of technical writing, but, at least for pay. But trained at Michigan State University, which was then and is now a place that produces hardcore objectivists. And that, of course, was somewhat consistent with my undergraduate work. So, but people like Chuck Berger, who is the author of Uncertainty Reduction Theory from Griffin, were in the same class. He's a hardcore objectivist, one of the best of them. Okay. But I also had a pretty strong interest at that point in how we use language in our interpersonal communication. So those were interpersonal communication and language use were really my interest at that point. Right in the middle of my graduate work, in 1967, the Václav Bevan and Jackson book, Pragmatics of Human Communication, came out. And that's one you've actually looked at. I was quite impressed by that at that point. I was very interested in systems theory. It was the first attempt to apply systems theory to communication issues. And probably wound up knowing more about that book and what was going on there than most of the faculty did. I met Barnett Pierce, Pierce and Cronin, coordinated management of meaning in the early 70s when he was still working on developing coordinated management of meaning theory. And I also was, felt that was a very important theory when it came out in book form in 1980. Along the way, since that time, I've become a hardcore interpretivist. Okay, not that I don't value what goes on in objectivist research, but that's not longer where I am. And the primary method I'm using at this point is conversation analysis, which is an interpretive method. So that's kind of where I've moved to. Got to UAF in 1979, teaching interpersonal and the language and communication course, kind of 320 course for the first time. And part of that course was having people look at theory by two anthropological linguists, Penelope Brown and Stephen Levinson, what's known as politeness theory. I don't think that's even mentioned anywhere in your film, okay? Because it's primarily a theory, at least it was originally a theory in anthropological linguistics. But what it does is, what it did was attempt to get at this notion of what we mean when we say we're being polite with others when we're talking with them. And very broadly, it is a theory of how we construct, one theory of how we construct social relationships in talk. And that's why I'm interested in the course. So we're going to get at this interest in language and interpersonal communication. So let me just very briefly sketch what that theory is about, because that's a key player in the story here. The theory uses the notion of face in the sense of gaining face and losing face. So if you're all familiar with the Chinese notion of gaining and losing face, things I say or do with you in interpersonal interaction may cause me either my face to either look better or to be damaged or lost in some way, or other people. If a rumor gets around that I have done some sort of shady business deal, I would lose face in the sight of other people. I would be seen as a less good person in the world and in this social thing. Well, Irving Goffman, a sociologist, borrowed that concept, although unfortunately he borrowed only part of the Chinese notion, and started using it in talking about social interaction in North America. Brown and Levinson borrowed from Goffman, the notion from Goffman. They redefined face basically in psychological terms as my personal need both to be, on the one hand, autonomous from others, to have a certain amount of independence and the ability to make my own decisions, as well as to be approved of by others, which for Americans is a very important thing. It's one of the places we get our sense of who we are, is whether other people like the kinds of things we do.
Is there some sense in which that, as Brown and Levinson conceive it, still doesn't translate well across cultures, though?
That's absolutely, and that's one of the critiques.
Oh, sorry.
That's one of the critiques that comes along. Because Penny Brown doesn't like this, but I maintain that what she came up with as these two face needs are really the American view of things. And they don't, one of the first major critiques was that from the Japanese, and this does not compute in Japan, okay, in Japanese culture.
Do you think that some of it's, okay, so I think that one big difference between our language and the Japanese language is that you is you and you and you and you and you and you and you. But in the Japanese language, you is you are my instructor, and you are my friend. And the way that you address those different things and how you actually present yourself in a language standpoint can drastically change.
So how many forms do they have for second person plural?
9,
Pronouns.
7 or 9.
Yeah, and about
Okay.
13 for the other person, yeah. And it stands out right away that the Japanese person literally cannot open his or her mouth unless they position themselves with respect to the other person. And there's just no way to get that. It's clearly a face issue, okay?
Yeah.
But it's not computable within
A simple grid of autonomy and approval.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And the whole notion of approval is not an issue in most parts of the world. People don't gain their sense of who they are by others approving them. But those are other issues. That's intercultural communication. Yeah.
Sorry.
The other thing they used was speech X theory. I gather you've read a little bit about that.
This is the Austin article on spelling ink,
That's right.
for those of you who might not have remembered.
And so what Brown and Levinson said is that speech acts inherently, at some level, threaten the face. And you can see that in the sense of if I order you to do something or request you to do something, I'm imposing on you a little bit. So I request you to help me do something or loan you $20. I'm imposing on your autonomy. All right, because if you grant the request, you have the choice to grant the request, granted, true, but you're now short $20, or you're going to give up some time to help me out studying or whatever it happens to be. Okay, so that's a threat to your status. Okay, and virtually every speech act has some sort of thing, even interesting enough compliments, which are threats to face because they are evaluations. All right, if I evaluate you, I'm at some level threatening your face. Well, Brown Levinson realized pretty clearly we've got to do those things in everyday life. We have to make requests. We like to give compliments, perhaps, or we choose to give compliments, a whole range of other things. So, since those are threatening the face, threatening at some level to the social relationship, how do we make up for that? Well, the notion is we make up for that by what's called being polite. We give some face back. At the same time, we take a little away so it balances out and the relationship doesn't change. All right? So if I want to make a request of you, I say, I really hate to bother you, because I know you're busy at exam time, but I suppose you could spend an hour or so tomorrow helping me study for this test. Yeah, what's the request there? The request is, we're going to study with the test. All right? What's all the other stuff? It's recognizing that she's a person who can make her own decisions. She has time constraints of her own. So in recognizing that, I'm sort of giving her some approval.
And isn't it interesting that being busy is a sign of approval, or acknowledging that Jordan being busy is a sign of approval of it? That's a giving face.
In this culture, yes, okay.
Yeah, that we value that so much.
Yeah, particularly in the university culture, that I'm valuing that in you, that you have your own demands and so on. If I didn't think anything of you as a woman, then I wouldn't do that. Okay. It's clear there are cultures where that's the case, but it's a different cultural framework. So that's the core of the theory, and this whole notion of balancing to keep social relationships intact.
Is that why we feel even almost more offended if we feel like the politeness is fake?
Mm-hmm.
Like if it's not genuine, that it almost feels like more of a, rather than you didn't even think about it, but you thought so little of it that you're just, like we get really frustrated, I think, when organizations or things do that to us, where it's like this scripted politeness.
Yep, you can get it on the phone or something like that.
Everything go back to brain.
The Indian call center, the Indian call center for the airline. Every utterance is followed by a yes sir or yes ma'am or something like that, and for Americans, just overdoes it. It's too much. yeah, we can way overdo it, and their theory dealt with that. Too much politeness, too much of these added strategies will backfire. So I actually don't want to get into politeness theory because my theory is opposite to it, but you need to know what it's stuck. Or it doesn't sound opposite, but it's a replacement for it. Politeness theory came to be was first proposed in '78, came to be very widely accepted. It is probably still the basis for the bulk of the work done in these sort of issues in language use. It is clearly established a paradigm, and it is or has been until relatively recently essentially the basis for normal science. Tremendous amount of research come out of this. Okay, still coming out of it. I mean, there's been a whole in early October. It's been 3 hours with a Mexican theorist. Was just firmly based still in Brown Levinson, and she knew I was somewhere else, so we were spending a lot of time talking. So there's a Kuhn sense. It's clearly a research paradigm. It's been really the only one. So early '80s, I'm teaching here, teaching the Common 320 course, and one of our majors writes a paper. She was interested in this politeness theory stuff. But one of these persons who's very observant about just everyday social interaction between people. And she argued, and had quite a bit of data to support her, that she was seeing utterances used in talk which didn't have any politeness in them, but were clearly being used to support people's face. Okay? They were what's called in Brown Levinson's theories bald on record utterances. They're just out there. They're direct orders, direct requests, direct assertions. I'm going to do something for you or whatever. But they were appearing in situations like at a funeral, where she finds herself addressing the mother of a boy who committed suicide. And everything she says is direct, bold on record. Okay? Well, if you've ever been in a situation like this, or you've been in an end-of-life situation with an older person, that's one of the things to actually recommend. You don't beat around the bush. You will die. Okay? You can't get a whole lot more direct than that, but you'll hear that. So her point was, what's going on here? This doesn't fit with the theory. We're clearly dealing with social relationships here. We're being supportive of faith. We're establishing tight bonds, but this is an anomaly in the theory. Okay? And here's Kuhn coming up. And she was right. We did a bunch of independent study work together, and that set me off thinking about theory. There was no politeness here, but clearly face was being managed somehow. And you know, I hope in your reading with Kuhn, one of the things you noticed is that you can go through a period of normal science where people are just sort of following the same paradigm, and all of a sudden anomalies in data start showing up that can't be explained in terms of the theory. This is exactly what Einstein did with Newton. Okay? And these will accumulate for a while. Okay? They'll just sort of exist a long time alongside the theory. So in '87, '88, I had a chance for a sabbatical. I decided to go to Cambridge, England, where Brown and Levinson were at that point, partly so I could have some contact with them. And that year's work raised quite a bit of doubts about the theory as a whole. It originally set out, well, we can revise the theory. And that's what often happens in science. Okay, you tinker with the theory a little bit in order to deal with the new data, but the tinkering has a limit, all right? And so at the end of that year, I was pretty much convinced that the theory as a whole had some problems. I didn't quite know where they were at that point. The other thing I was convinced of at that point was that this autonomy approval thing, which I was still using at that point, was probably a dialectic. Okay, because I'd run into some of Barbara Montgomery's early writing on dialectical views in Com. And of course, she's Baxter and Montgomery, relational dialectics theory. But I was just sort of holding on that. Short story here. Since the mid-'80s, politeness theory, this goes back to your point, has accumulated a whole lot of anomalies, things that just can't be explained within the theory. The first critiques coming from Japanese, cultural critiques, but a lot more to follow that. It doesn't work in other cultures. And a whole range of serious critiques. Some based in data, some not, some quite theoretical. The original theory, for example, is very much tied to a model of people as rational economic beings. Okay, that's the balancing the costs, all right, kind of thing. And we aren't that, okay, especially in personal relationships. Brown, Levinson, and Missells, in a comment in '87, made two, what to me are the most fundamental critiques of their own theory. One of them was that it was framed in terms of individual cognitions. And this includes the speech act stuff. There's a little bit of social recognition in Searle's speech acts, but it is a model of how individuals create one kind of medium, okay? And they were firmly based in that, and they critiqued that. They didn't know what to do with it. They said critiqued that. The other one was that they realized that the theory was unable to address how face or politeness is constituted in the actual interaction between people. Because at that point they were aware of conversation analysis and what it does in terms of the interaction between people. So if you're a fan of speech acts, I'm afraid I'm not. Okay, I'd be glad to talk with you about why. But it is only now that we're coming back to those niche issues and starting to rethink them in terms of human interaction. And where that will come out, I don't know. But that's work that's ongoing right at this moment, all over the world, actually. Okay, so in order to address these critiques, these anomalies, to solve the puzzles that kind of got me started or interested in this work, I basically had to develop a new theory. One that I would think would encompass or address these critiques and encompass some of the anomalies like the ones my student had pointed out quite a while ago. It turns out to be a theory on a completely different framework than Brown and Levinson's, and using a different epistemology, a different model of communication, and different epistemology. One specifically that views communication as constitutive. So hence, in this sense, like symbolic interaction and coordinated management of meaning. And so I would argue that this theory comprises a paradigm shift, because research done, well, first of all, the theory itself is incommensurate with Brown and Levinson. Face constituting theory, which is named for my theory, is not commensurate with, just doesn't fit. It's in a different ballpark than is Brown and Levinson's. It also, however, and this is typical, subsumes their theory in the sense that it can explain the phenomena they dealt with, as well as a whole bunch of other ones. All right? And I don't mean to compare ourselves with Einstein at all, but that's exactly what relativity theory did with respect to Newtonian theory. It explained all that basic stuff if you make some limiting instructions, plus a whole lot more stuff, which Newton didn't even know about. I think I can show that this theory does that. Now, whether it'll prove out depends, just like Einstein's theory, on the amount of research that gets done on it. But that research is happening, so both mine and elsewhere. So that's kind of what way I would see that here. I may be being a bit grandiose, but it fits with that.
We like grandiose here.
Yeah, too do I. Okay, so let me kind of characterize the new theory for you, face-constituting theory for you, in the terms you used in the course, because that's actually one of the ways I think a book like Griffin is useful to you. If you can figure out that a theory is principally approached as, or research is principally coming from a theory is approached from an interpretive perspective versus an objectivist perspective, you know something about where to put the theory. Okay? This is clear on the interpretive side, in terms of the methodologies that are involved. In terms of the various traditions of theorizing, it's squarely in the middle of the sociocultural tradition, along with symbolic interaction, along with coordinated management of meaning. So it views human communication as constitutive of the meanings we have in interaction, but in the very broad sense as constitutive of the worlds we live in, ourselves, everything else, constitutive of identity, the world we know, and the world we assume other people to know. In Dietz's terms, in his two dimensions, which I have problems with because they're so reductive, it's a local emergent theory, very much deals with things arising right in interaction between people. It is, however, not, in his terms, deconstructionist or postmodern, I would say. It probably falls into postmodernism, but I don't think that's a useful category in this case. Right. So that's kind of in the very broad sense where it fits in. It does, the theory, face-constituting theory, rejects understanding face or relationships in terms of the properties of individual human beings. That's not where the action is in the explanation. Now that doesn't deny that our own thinking has part of things. Obviously it does, okay? But that's not where the primary basis for the explanation is. We don't explain face in terms of individual wants and needs. Explained it elsewhere, we'll get to that. Does reject Spurl's speech acts as a basis. In the article you didn't get to read, which is a quite recent one, I make a distinction between three different kinds of explanations of human phenomena. One of them is what I call person-centered explanations, and those are the ones you typically find in psychology. Okay? Because psychology is the study of human individuals. Okay? Another kind of explanation I describe is what I call a macro-social explanation. And this is what you find in sociology. So you take a broad characteristic of a society. One of the ones that's been used with respect to face issues is societies as collectivist versus individualist. Okay, and that's Hofstede's, one of Hofstede's dimensions. So you characterize the entire society, like Japan as a collectivist society, and then use this to explain what's going on in interaction. Because they're collectivists, they do X kinds of things, okay, versus Americans who are individualists, okay, and do these kinds of things. It's a macro-social because you take this broad characteristic of a whole group and use it to explain what's going on in individuals. And the third kind of explanation I created, and there certainly would be other ones, but it's what I call a micro-social or an interactional explanation. And these are what you find in places like Harold Garfinkel's work, or which is who we certainly probably won't be getting. He's a sociologist, micro-sociologist, or
we did actually do a quick Garfinkel, or at least
yes, it's the same Garfinkel, but other parts of his work.
Yeah.
Or in conversation analysis. So this 320 course is very much a micro-social, look at micro-social interaction.
Are there other disciplines